Hello from wherever you are, and welcome to Let's Play Games. I'm John McFarland, Adult Services Librarian for Nashville Public Libraries, and I hope you'll join me in learning or rediscovering some of the more common and uncommon games out there. This time, we're going to go into a game that we haven't done a particular style before. There is no dice to this game. It is all about your words, your wits, and your ability to make and occasionally break some agreements. Diplomacy. Let's get stuck in. This game, at its heart, is a contest between individual units and individual units. This is part of the game in that your armies and navies could only occupy so much space. And if they were in contest, somebody still had to have control over it to a certain extent. So what we have here are the 7 major countries who were considered great powers in Europe at the time. Historically, up until about the 1900s, the United States would sometimes be considered a great power, but they are not included here, even though they did eventually get involved with the Great War. Here, everyone is separated out into kind of major descriptions of areas and regions. So Berlin is listed here for Germany. Prussia is a historical name for this region right here. It was the name for hundreds of years and still kind of informally is. Silesia was a nation state for a long time. Warsaw is a city in modern-day Poland. The Ukraine is also the modern-day country. Sevastopol is specifically the city right here. And I'm going to notate the stars here. So think of these stars as your basis of operation, the places that you know if you were playing this country, you would want to defend. These stars are basically your home bases. They're going to become drastically important here. So what you have is all countries have, let me put it in the center here, armies and navies. And only one army or navy can occupy each state. So you can't have, got Naples right here. They can't be intersecting in the same spot, but you can have Rome and you can have Naples. And then there's also one in Venice here. Initially, this board does lend itself to being kind of crowded at points, but in general, what you have is an initial set up for each player. And the way that you notate who has control of what are these little coins right here. And then usually what I end up doing, especially if there's an army here in Rome, I kind of know that there's one here, but I'll just kind of put it over top so you know where they are. And this would be part of your initial setup. Notice that Trieste, which is right here, is occupied by Austria-Hungary, and historically that's who controlled the territory for the longest time. What happens here is that, yes, it gets a little crowded, but in general, you know who is occupying what. And I will say, in general, the rule set is that everyone's starting pieces are some combination of 3 to 4, in the case of Russia, armies and fleets in a particular combination. So the differences here between how the pieces can move. The fleets can occupy any sea location. They can occupy anything with a coastal location. So your fleet, for example, can't go over here to Serbia, which is landlocked. Your army pieces, on the other hand, cannot go into any sea-based location unless, there's always a caveat, they're allowed to be convoyed. So if you have, let's say that you want to move from Rome to Tunis over here on the bottom of the map. Because you have a fleet here, you could actually move this army piece by convoy through the Tyrrhenian Sea to Tunis and occupy that space. You have to hold it for at least one round, and then you would be able to claim that space as what we call a supply center. The reason why supply centers are going to be important are when you have, let's go ahead and give Tunis to the Italians here. When it comes time for the end of the year, we actually have a phase of the game where you can add units based on the amount of territory that you control. So if you have, let's say, 6 regions, you would have the ability to have a total of 6 units on the field. Here is the catch. Notice that there are 3 sort of home areas within the home territory of each country. If something is on it and you are eligible for another build, if you can't place it there, you won't be able to place the unit, period. So for example, let's say you've got a piece on Venice and you're eligible for 1 more. Your Rome piece is here, your Naples piece is here. Even though you're eligible to put a piece there, and it can either be an army or a navy, and you see there's a large stack of pieces, it can be pretty close to as much as going to fit on this field for the game. You can't build it there. So now we need to get to the object of this game. You need to control, for a solo win, 18 of these supply centers. So Portugal, Spain, Brest, Paris, Marseille, Venice, Rome, Naples, Trieste, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, Constantinople, Smyrna, Ankara. That would be a pretty wide base for if Italy held all these territories, they may end up winning a solo win. Diplomacy is also different in that you can agree as a group with the remaining players, usually 2 or so have to be eliminated in a 7-player game, to agree to a draw. There is a point at which enough pieces will be on the board in enough of a squeeze that it will not work out. So you can agree to a draw well into the game when you kind of know that no one else is going to be eliminated. It's kind of a draw as it is, and nobody's going to even be able to make or break an agreement that would help them in one way or the other. So how do you acquire these centers if, well, they're occupied? This is where the concept of support comes into play. In order to move a unit from its region, you have to have more than 1 unit attacking it or supporting the attack. I'll go over the full writing out of supports because all of this is written down. Usually there's somebody, you can either have a neutral arbiter if somebody wants to, or have it rotate among the players, where you're going to all submit the orders of what your units are going to do at the same time. So let's say as Italy, I say, okay, I want to take my army from Venice to Trieste. And when you write out the orders, like, okay, you're attacking Venice, you're trying to hold Trieste, because it's 1-on-1, nothing happens and everybody stays here. Let's say, as another example, let's say this army's right here, that Austria-Hungary is attacking Venice here, and we'll say the fleet's out here, or nope, it can still be in Trieste because it has this border. The fleet is supporting the attack because it is along the coast, so it's not landlocked. It is at that point that the unit would become dislodged. It is at that juncture that you have to figure out where your piece goes. So as long as you have an eligible retreat for this army that's either Piedmont, Tuscany, or Apulia, because you see, can't go into Tyrol, can't go into Trieste. So at this point, it would be this unit here, and let's go ahead and move this to Piedmont for the sake of conversation. And it can actually retreat to Rome. I apologize for that. So at this point, Italy still controls the piece. They've got a round to get the unit back. If they can't, what'll happen is they will take this piece off the board, and Austria-Hungary will add its piece on, giving them another supply center. So take a step back. I know this is a lot to take in for this particular game. I'm going to talk a bit about the history of the time period today. And then we can get into some of the nuance of the gameplay and negotiation and how things shake out. 1 second. Now's a good time to talk about the context of the time period, because this game is based on a factual time. So let me show you this map, and I can point out a couple things. I talked about earlier how the game technically starts in 1901, but realistically it reflects the borders right before the Great War in 1914. A couple things to point out here. Bosnia, which modern day exists right about here, is already annexed. That doesn't happen until 1912. Most of this is all situated from some of the Balkan Wars of 1904, 1908, and 1912, so the Balkan League is all neutral here. Also, important to note that North Africa and Tunis are listed as neutral. They are part of the French colonial empire by this point in 1914, but for the purposes of this game, with its game design, it ends up being neutral for balancing the game out. So that's a little bit more about the time period. I will get into some of these complex alliances in just a moment. I went ahead and set up the board because that way I can go into detail about each country. So I'll start from this part. Notice that the players will usually end up sitting roughly here because it's easiest for them to sit and move their arms. So starting over here with Austria-Hungary, they've got an army unit in Budapest, an army unit in Vienna, and a navy unit in Trieste. This is consistently, it's always the same setup, so you don't have to worry about picking and choosing what type of army or fleet that you want to use. So looking at this, part of your initial strategy is you've got to consider a couple things. You've got Russia over here. Germany's usually an ally for most games. You've got all of this neutral territory over here to compete for. And the Italians over here are right next to you. So in the time period, Austria-Hungary and Italy were actually rivals for quite a few things. So usually there ends up being a fair amount of tension based on how close each person is. So that's something to consider as you see these pieces. You would think about where do you want to try and move these to get an advantage. Next up, we'll do Italy, which I've already kind of talked about. There's an army in Venice. There's an army in Rome. There's a fleet in Naples. Here, you've got the Mediterranean as your buffer, but also causes a little bit of issue with movement because you're going to go into a conflict with Austria-Hungary. Well, if they're focusing on you, you can't move. Do you then attack France? Speaking of France, you've got Marseille, you've got Paris with 2 armies, and then Brest, which used to be referred to as Brittany, but the city is Brest, and there's a fleet there. Here you've got the traditional rival Germany. Notice you've got some neutral territory over here. One of the most common strategies for France at the beginning of the game to increase their strength is to occupy neutral Portugal and Spain. There's no consequence for invading a neutral nation within the context of this game. You will occupy that area, and let's consider it more a sphere of influence than necessarily occupation. Next up will be England. They have 2 fleets rather than 2 armies. Fleet in Edinburgh, a fleet in London, and an army in Liverpool. Part of England's big challenge is, notice, they're the only island here, and they've got to get to mainland Europe quickly. If you need 18 supply centers, you've got 3 here, you're going to have to get them from somewhere. Now, Germany. Berlin, an army. Munich, an army. Kiel, a fleet. Germany has probably one of the most complex starting situations, considering usually Russia and France pretty often want to take care of Germany very fast. Typically because if they're able to make any sort of alliance and set up a buffer zone, they can be really defensive. And they've got a little bit of an outlet between these low countries right here, Holland, Belgium, and also the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Last, the Russians. The Russians are the exception. They have 4 units rather than 3 to start off. They've got an army in Warsaw, an army in Moscow, a fleet in St. Petersburg, and a fleet in Sevastopol. I also need to talk about the coastlines that are here. Notice there's North Coast and South Coast in St. Petersburg. At the beginning of the game, typically, the fleet starts off in the south coast of St. Petersburg. You can eventually decide to create a fleet and put it on the north coast, where it can go into the Barents Sea right here on its turn. It has a direct contact with either the Norwegian Sea or Norway because of these borders here. So sometimes a Russian player will try and sneak into Scandinavia that way. But notice they can technically get to it straight away based on this little connection up here. So usually it can work out. They also have to consider that Turkey is a historical rival. Austria-Hungary is a historical rival. Germany is a historical rival. So they're going to have to make some agreements with somebody. So now it's time to talk about the importance of negotiation and discussion. There's no dice rolls. And because there's no dice rolls, everything is happening concurrently. So the first turn is usually some period of time. It recommends 30 minutes. It is at this point where the fun begins. You are encouraged to use any means of communication necessary, any type of agreement you want to make, any sort of compromise with other countries. So let's take the Austro-Hungarian player first. Let's say they really want to try and go after Italy first. Well, they have to get on Russia's good side. So what they would do is they would take the time to talk with the Russian player and say, hey, I want to support you for your invasion of, I'll give you Romania and Bulgaria and kind of help you with Turkey here, but I want you to leave me be for a little bit so that way I can rudimentarily try and take out Italy, and then I'll help you later by supporting you against Germany. This is the point where the idea of backstabbing comes into play. This is one of the few games where you're encouraged to backstab at some point or another. And this is also one of the more complex elements because you can negotiate in any way within the context of the game. There's no like money that's supposed to change hands. This is supposed to be a diplomatic and honorable situation. So what you have here is that 30-minute period. I've seen players use text messages in person. They've written each other notes like you're going back to middle school, or even face-to-face conversations and some kind of sideways looks over to somebody else. You can negotiate however you like. I have seen literal treaty signings in games before. And then those treaty signings being ripped in half about 3 hours later. So before you think that this is, an 8-hour endeavor, usually the second and subsequent turns are only 15 minutes. Because at that point, your ideas change. Let's say that Russia is occupying Turkey. Russia and Turkey are not going to be typically negotiating. Germany may be negotiating with Russia to hold them off for a little bit. And if a backstab comes, well, there's not a lot of conversation that's going to happen between Germany and Russia after that point. Same with France and Italy, or England and Germany if they decide to make an alliance. So take the context out of the time period for a little bit and assume nothing about the intent of countries. They're just the countries on the board. The element here is the negotiation. So I'm going to go through, made an example for like the first turns and how we describe them. Because as I said, you're supposed to write down orders and give it to someone neutral. That person is supposed to handle the rules of how a negotiation happens. So I've got this here. So for this turn, Austria is going to send its army from Budapest to Serbia. And you would write this out as A, referring to the army, the original location, Budapest, which would be BUD or some sort of indication. The game usually suggests that you have to be very specific with your wording, but for a casual game, even if you're playing a little more seriously, err on the side of intent in case somebody makes a goof. But if they explain to you the thing that they want and it can't happen, that's another topic entirely. They're going to move their fleet from Trieste to Albania, because remember, it's not landlocked, so they're moving down here. And then what they're going to do is move their army that's in Vienna and move it to Galicia. So Russia, this is kind of hostile towards Russia, they would have no forethought of what happens until it's all revealed at the same time. I'll get to that in a minute. Now, England, I'm going in alphabetical order here. The Edinburgh Navy is going to be moved to the North Sea. This allows for the army to potentially be convoyed to either Norway, Denmark, Holland, or Belgium. It's all within their realm. Now, the fleet is going to move from London to the English Channel. Let's say that they decided that they wanted to invade France. They would have through here the ability to go into Belgium, based on this connection, Picardy, and Brest, or move their fleet to the Irish Sea or Mid-Atlantic Ocean, which is MAO for short. This is their initial setup for when they move from Liverpool to Wales. So this takes out the Yorkshire possibility and the Edinburgh possibility to move into some of the Scandinavian countries. That's their turn. The French is going to move their fleet from Brest into the Mid-Atlantic Ocean. They have the option to go into North Africa, which is not a supply center, Portugal, which is, and Spain, which is. But note, you could only go to the north coast of Spain. You would have to move into the Western Mediterranean or to the south coast, which would take another turn. Think of it as a consistent movement. What else are they going to do? We're going to put them from Marseille into Spain. So they're going to go for this territory. I'm going to go ahead and place their little unit here. We'll get to the build in a moment. And the last one they're going to do is army from Paris to Picardy. So this is another defensive movement to see about Holland and Belgium, what happens there. Germany, they're going to move their army from Berlin to Kiel. And this fleet is going to move from Kiel to Denmark. So we'll go ahead and put another supply center piece there. And then Munich to Ruhr. So they're moving towards France. They probably have an agreement between, looking at this board, either England is going to agree with Germany to attack the same time and divvy up the territory, or Russia has agreed to a détente. And by détente, I mean a truce, we're not going to attack you, you don't attack us. Italy is going to put their fleet from Naples to the Ionian Sea here. The army is going to move from Rome to Venice. And the other army from Venice is going to move into Trieste. So knowing what we know when these turns are revealed, you're probably wondering, why would Austria-Hungary let their territory go like that? Well, it's because they're agreeing, okay, you can take Trieste, but we have a détente. I'm going after Russia or Turkey, and I'm going to go down here. So it comes out in the wash that they get another supply center anyways. So let me go and add this little bit to them. And then we're not moving this one yet because a turn hasn't elapsed. Now it's time for Russia. They're going to go from Moscow. Sorry. The army is going to go from Moscow to Ukraine. The fleet is going to go from Sevastopol to Romania. Let me get a little note there. And they're going to take the St. Petersburg south coast to the Gulf of Bothnia. Now, here's where we run into our first conflict. Their other move is Warsaw to Galicia. So remember, Austria-Hungary tried to move it there. Well, here's where combat comes into play. It's 1-on-1. Remember, it has to be an outnumbering. So this does what's called a bounce. So it moves back and moves back. So everybody goes back to where they initially attacked. So it bounced, and next turn, you figure out what happens. Lastly, Turkey. They're going to move their fleet from Ankara to Constantinople. They're going to move Constantinople's army to Bulgaria. And then the Smyrna army is going to go to Ankara. So let's take a look here real quick at what happened with the what's called Spring 1901 movement. England has set themselves up to potentially go after France if there's an agreement there. They also, if they can get another supply center, they can go after the Scandinavian countries. Germany looks to be going after the Scandinavian countries and defending against France and the Low Countries being occupied by either one of them. France is doing a very traditional way of they can get basically 2 supply centers for free by taking Portugal and Spain. Italy is probably agreeing to be involved in the Balkans here and maybe go after Turkey. Austria-Hungary looks like it's going into the Balkans area to try and get what they can before the Russians attack. I don't think there's a truce there. Turkey seems to be also going for the Balkans. It's curious to see who has an agreement with whom. And Russia appears to be moving south at present. So this is where, as the next turn comes into play, everybody is going to have some renegotiation. Things might change. For example, if Austria-Hungary and Italy had said, hey, I'm not going to take Trieste, and then all of a sudden they take Trieste, part of an idea of, okay, well, I guess I'm not allied with you anymore. So Austria-Hungary could talk with France or maybe Turkey about some sort of arrangement. This is definitely a game of negotiation. And if you take it piece by piece, you will find that the game gets more interesting as it goes along. Let me take another step back. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the history of this time period, and then I will get into the next turn and building units because, oh, we're going to have some eligibility here. One sec. Just a little bit more about the time period because I want to get at least to the start of the Great War where this map really ends up changing after. So anyone who's studied the time period would know about the assassination of Austrian Archduke, which was one of their highest leaders, Franz Ferdinand, and they were assassinated by a Serb. The problem we had is that the Russians supported the Serbs. Well, Austria-Hungary wanted recompense. They also did want a war for prestige purposes, so they sent 10 conditions for, hey, we won't invade you if you do these things. And they agreed to 9 of them, but the last one they couldn't because it was basically accepting responsibility. Austria-Hungary got in touch with Germany. Germany gave them basically a blank check, and they were going to support their ally no matter what. So now we had Austria-Hungary, who knows that Germany has their back, and then Russia's going to protect Serbia. Russia's going to call in its friend France, who is wanting to have a conflict with Germany to get back. See right here that there's this little bit missing from France? That's Alsace-Lorraine, which was lost to Germany in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War. Well, they want it back. England was going to support France no matter what, and they almost stopped themselves, except for the fact that the Germans decided to invade neutral Belgium as a way to get into France. This kind of compelled England to get involved. So there's a quote by Otto von Bismarck, who said in the 1890s, and this was remarkably prescient, that if a major war starts in Europe again, it will be because of some damned thing in the Balkans. Well, he was right. Welcome back. So let's reset the situation, then I will move into the next turn and provide a little bit more description of how you can write out some of these orders, because they are important. The Russians appear to be moving down south into the Balkans and probably against Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary probably was hoping that they could avoid that, but doesn't look like it's going to happen. Turkey and Austria-Hungary both seem to be going for the same Balkan area. There's only one place that isn't claimed as neutral, and that's Greece here. But I kind of like the idea of, notice the Albanian fleet is here. The Italian fleet is here. That could come into play very quickly. Italy seems to also be moving towards that Balkan area, but keeping their options open. The French are moving towards the Iberian coast. That's the name of this region here, going for these basically free supply centers. England's setting themselves up for trying to intervene in one way or the other, either to intervene against France or try and see if they can take some of the Norwegian, Swedish provinces there. Now, Germany appears to be doing a pretty standard Scandinavian push, also into the Low Countries. That's going to come into play quick, because you kind of have to move fast in this game and go for specific objectives. You want to take the least frustrating route to get to 18 supply centers as possible. So you don't need to plan for, okay, I'm going to go as Germany, through Austria-Hungary, through Turkey, and then back up to Russia. It's just not going to work. You want to consider the places that you are most likely able to get and most likely able to achieve. So for Germany, they've got the 3, Belgium, Holland, that's 5, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, that's 8. I'll take it Warsaw, 9, St. Petersburg, 10, lucky enough to get Moscow, it's 11, Edinburgh, Liverpool, London, that's still 14. You still need 4 more. So that could be Paris, Brest, Marseille, and Sevastopol, or at that point, you can go for Vienna or Budapest. You have to consider the least frustrating route to get to 18. Or if you're not going to get to 18, how quickly you can get to a line where you have a decent amount of points and be involved in that draw. Because sometimes just surviving and having 3 supply centers but being involved in a 4-way draw, yeah, you're last in that group of 4, but you made it to the end. So now our next turn here. We're going to have Austria have their fleet go from Albania to Greece. That gives them another supply center. So that's just written as FALB -GRE for Greece. But again, take it easy the first time you're playing this, where if it's Albania to Greece, no one needs to harp over that. So now here we've got a little bit of complexity based on this little conflict right here. So I'm going to move back to this in a second, but one of the moves is going to be Vienna and Galicia. They're going to want to try again. Maybe they've got a tentative agreement. I'll go ahead and spoil this for you. Russia tries the same thing. They bounce again. But Ukraine could have been involved. But I'll get to that in a moment. I'm just going to put these 2 right here. So I'll go ahead and move to England for a second. So the fleet is going to move from Wales and through a convoy to Belgium. So we're going to squeeze in here. Give them the tip for that. So they probably made an agreement with France of, hey, you're getting this territory down here. I need a supply center too. I don't want Germany to get it. So can you just make sure that I get it? France like, okay, that's cool. So England gets that one. So you would write that out as actually as though it's the fleet's order. So it would be, I'm taking my fleet that's in the English Channel and I'm convoying it, it's a C, from Wales to Belgium. So that way you know exactly where the units are moving. Their fleet is going to go from the North Sea to Norway. That's another little point there. And then the other piece you're going to write is that, hey, my army is going from Wales to Belgium. So you have to make sure that it all adds up and that all of your pieces are accounted for. For France, they're going to take Mid-Atlantic Ocean to Portugal. I said, it's 2 supply centers. That's a really good idea to do. It keeps it off of your home turf. Your Picardy is going to move to Brest. And then at this point, you don't have to move a piece. You can do what's called a hold. So you would write in, my army in Spain holds, A-S-B-A-H. So this way, no need to move anywhere, because otherwise they could go back to Marseille, but if they put the unit in Marseille, they can't build it because it's a home turf and they're going to have things to build. For Germany, they're going to move from Denmark to the North Sea. They probably had an agreement about who was going to be involved with Norway. There's going to have the army from Kiel to Denmark, just to make sure that worked out. And you have Ruhr to Holland. So they probably just all agreed, okay, we're going to split up these units. Here's why the orders matter. Let's say, for the sake of conversation, that they did not, on the English side, invade Norway. And let's say they moved their fleets into the North Sea, but the German did not move from Kiel to Denmark. It would mean that the English player has pretty much backstabbed Germany and is going to take control of that Denmark province regardless of what happened. So this is why you have to account for not only where my piece is going to move, but where could my opponent's pieces move as well. So it's at this point where Germany's kind of got themselves set up over here in the corner. And then we'll move on to Italy. Ionian Sea, their fleet is going to move over to Tunisia. No one's really going to be able to stop them on that one. Their army in Trieste is going to hold. So because of that hold, and we know that it succeeds, we're going to take the Austro-Hungarian pip off here, and we are going to put it on the Italian. So Italy now has 5 centers of control. Now, what I'll also note is that this is where supporting units come into play. Let's say that Austria-Hungary is like, now wait a minute, I want my place back. And they had a way of supporting it, let's say through this Albania move. They could have taken it back by my army's moving here, and they're being supported by this fleet. But since that's not happening, what the unit is army, Trieste, hold, A, tree with an H, and then the A in Venice is going to support. So you put an S and then Trieste. So that way you now have where that unit supported. You need to bring 3 units rather than 2 in order to move me from that space. Now we've got Russia. They're going to move into Sweden. Move that here. Pieces always end up toppling. So their fleet is wanting to go from Romania to Bulgaria here. One-on-one, they can't possibly do this on their own. So this is where the agreements come into play. And this is probably the negotiation that Austria-Hungary made. Hey, I'm not going to attack you, but I need your help getting control of Bulgaria. And in exchange, I won't attack you. So what you would have is you can cooperate as a team. You would have fleet Romania, so FRUM, to Bulgaria East Coast, because there is a South Coast. And it's going to be moving back up to Austria. AV, so the one in Serbia, ASER, is going to support, and this is the way that you write it. If you're supporting an attack, you have to say where the attack is coming from and where the attack is supposed to go. So it'd be Romania to Bulgaria, East Coast. This is how you know that when everything is done at the same time, it succeeds, because it basically looks like that. That means that this piece is dislodged. We'll get to that in just a moment. Turkey is also going to move their fleet from Constantinople to the Aegean, and their army is going to go from Ankara to Constantinople. So now we run into Turkey's problem. They've just been attacked by both Russia and Austria-Hungary. Their unit needs somewhere to go. So let's look in what's Bulgaria. So there's Romania. Well, they just attacked from there, so that's not available to retreat to. Serbia, that's not available to be retreated to. Greece is occupied. That's not available to retreat to, because the retreats happen basically after the conflict has resolved itself. And Constantinople is a successful order that just moved up. And it's an army, so it can't move into either the Black Sea or the Aegean Sea. It is at this point that Turkey loses their peace. they have nowhere to go. So it basically gets squished, and the Russian player gets another piece based on this. So now let's take a little bit of a stock as to who is where and who can build where. Russia has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So they're eligible to have a total of 7 on the board as long as it's not a piece that's occupied. So Warsaw is not able to be constructed. And what you have is, we're going to put a fleet onto St. Petersburg, but we're going to put it on the north coast this time. So you have to designate which. You're going to put an army unit on Moscow, and you're going to put another fleet unit on Sevastopol. So now Russia has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pieces on the board that matches their supply centers, and they were all eligible to be built. So now let's just kind of move around here. There are still 3 supply centers, so they're able to get something back. They're going to put a fleet over in Ankara. Now in Austria-Hungary, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4. So they can get 1 more unit. And we're going to put a nice little army in Budapest. And then this guy stays in Vienna. For Italy, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they're going to put a fleet in Naples and an army in Rome. For the French, they've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they are going to decide to put an army in Paris, because they can only be built at the supply centers, a fleet in Marseille. So that catches them up. England has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they're going to actually build 2 fleets. One in Edinburgh, one in London. So no more armies yet. They've just only got the 1. Germany has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they're going to put 1 fleet in Kiel. This is where it gets kind of crowded at the little points. And 1 army in Munich. So this brings everybody all around the board. And yes, the map is a little crowded, but this is where negotiation takes place anew. And this is just 1 turn. But right now, we've got Austria's kind of getting squished, but they've got this nice little alliance with Russia. England's gotten themselves in Scandinavia. They probably have an agreement with Russia to not attack each other, perhaps. Or the Germans say, hey, we're going to go after France. You're safe to go up there. The French are doing their traditional opening, but they're getting their units ready to involve themselves, probably against Germany, but they're waiting to see, does something happen with England? Italy is probably in agreement with Russia, and maybe possibly going after Turkey here in a moment, because now with these fleets, you've got some options. For Turkey, I think you're just trying to hold on for right now. Sevastopol is probably concerning. You want to get out to the Black Sea. You want to see if you can take some of this area back. And Russia's trying to just stretch out its tendrils. But they seem to be moving south for the moment and go after Turkey first. This is where the negotiation takes place and is important. And from here, you have your next set of negotiation. You continue on for the spring season. And then we just did the fall season, with the build phase being known as the winter season. Now it's back to spring, and by the end of the fall season, how many supply centers are you going to get? Now Russia's out to an early lead, but they've got quite a few to go. So it's all a question of how you build, how you negotiate, and how well your agreements really are. I promised you a little bit about some of the entangling alliances that are involved here. Let me show you on this map where some of them were. We have the dual alliance here between Germany and Austria-Hungary. That was in 1879. Then we also have the Triple Alliance, which was sort of like a central alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. That was in the 1880s, roughly. Then in the 1890s, we had a formalized agreement between France and Russia to counteract the threat of Germany and Austria-Hungary. We also had the historical rivals, England and France, set aside their differences in what we call the Entente Cordiale in 1904, because for the longest time, England and Germany were close cousins, including the fact that the throne of England came from descent Germanic leaders. So England and France have set aside their differences. We also saw a limited amount of alliances between Germany and Turkey, which, as we know, when the Great War happens, Turkey does join the war on the side of the Central Powers, but Italy does not. They end up joining in 1916 with the French, the Russians, and the English. So it all starts melding together as to the difficult issues that arise when some diplomatic conflict escalates hard. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for tuning in. Next time, now that we've got the basics, we're going to go into another level with some advanced strategies to try, and I'm going to show you how the world's best players play this game. See you next time.